Hello, welcome to Crash Course AP World History. Today I'll be discussing World War II. The causes of World War II are pretty simple. After the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles were signed, there was political turmoil in Europe at the time. It caused for the rise of fascism, which is an authoritarian and nationalistic right-wing system of government and social organization. This was evident in Germany with Hitler and Italy with Mussolini. Then we go to the Pacific side of the war, where the Japanese were very expansionistic and also believed in a philosophy called militarization, which is the process by which a society organizes itself for military conflict and violence. This can be seen at the rape of Nanking after they invaded China in 1937. The rape of Nanking was a brutal situation where the Japanese soldiers pretty much raped and murdered and massacred many civilians of Nanking. The Japanese also invaded many parts of the Pacific along with China, as they invaded Indonesia, South Indochina, New Guinea, and many other Pacific islands, which caused them to enter the war as well. And then Germany, they started World War II by invading Poland in 1939. They used a military formation called Blitzkrieg, which is a swift victory over another territory. The Germans were not done after invading Poland, as they went to invade France, and then they attempted to invade Britain. But first, the Battle of Britain took place, where the Germans bombed the crap out of London and other cities in England in order to try and force them into peace negotiations so they could control most of Europe. And if you want to look at this picture right here, we have a picture of the British flag, as they did not surrender to the Germans, and we have a picture of the French flag during World War II because they surrendered within 3 weeks because they could not and did not want to fight the Germans like every other ally. After the invasions of Western Europe, the Germans soon looked to advance in the Soviet Union, where they underwent Operation Barbarossa, which used the same military technique as they did against Poland, Blitzkrieg, as they went to invade the Soviet Union very quickly. However, they were stopped short at Moscow, where the Russians soon fought back and ended up holding off the Germans and forcing the Germans to retreat during the winter. After the Battle of Moscow, the Russians also won another key victory at Stalingrad, where the Germans fiercely tried to invade the city of Stalingrad, which is along the Volga River, but the Russians fiercely fought back and pushed the Germans out of Russia, and that began the retreat of the Germans out of Russia. The funny part about the German advance among Russia is that Hitler studied Napoleon, and Napoleon attempted to invade Russia during the winter, and he failed, and as many others have during history, they failed except the Mongols. And the funny thing is, he still invaded Russia during the winter, and that he failed because history was not on his side. Like, come on, man. Like, on a scale from 1 to bad, how bad was Hitler's war plans? It was, let's win a war on 2 fronts, and one of the fronts being Asia during the winter. Back to the Pacific theater of war, the Japanese decided to attack Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. They sent 3 waves of planes, which totaled 350 planes, and it was a surprise attack on December 7th, 1941. During the attack, they destroyed many aircrafts at 4 air bases in Pearl Harbor, and they also sunk many ships such as the U.S. Arizona and damaged the naval fleet. After the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese soon attacked places such as Guam, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. And in the Philippines, they were involved with the March of Bataan, which had 15,000 American soldiers as prisoners of war. Adding on to the prisoners of war aspect, the Japanese brutally treated their prisoners of war. They tortured them, they killed them, and they forced them to work in extreme labor camps, violating the Geneva Convention agreement in the 20s. After Pearl Harbor, this caused the Americans to declare war on the Japanese. And because the Japanese and the Germans were allies, this caused Germany to declare war on the Americas. This put America now involved in the war after trying to sit out of the war for many years. After the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attempted to attack Midway, which was known as the Battle of Midway. But however, this did not end well for the Japanese, as the Americans destroyed the Japanese fleet in the Pacific, sinking 4 out of the 6 carriers that they had in the Pacific that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. They also sank 1 heavy cruiser, while the United States only lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and 1 other. This was a key victory for the Americans, as they destroyed the Japanese fleet in the Pacific and severely damaged their ability to make war in the sea. They soon then went to advance along to Guadalcanal and other parts of the Pacific. Guadalcanal was a lengthy battle that the Americans ended up winning, but they did not win without heavy costs. The Japanese would often banzai attack, which is charge all at once in order to attack the Americans in masses. But the Americans prevailed and ended up defeating the Japanese, and this was evident throughout most of the Pacific during the beginning of the years of the war. This type of technique stopped at the Battle of Peleliu. The Americans were also involved in a process called island hopping, which the Japanese were stationed on islands in a series of islands, but they'd skip some islands and cut off their supply line, so they would starve to death rather than taking over and losing soldiers unnecessarily. Also, on the western front of the world during World War II, the Germans and the Italians invaded North Africa because it was a key strategic point for the Mediterranean, and it cut off British Africa and all their colonies that they had. In North Africa, the Allies ended up beating the Germans and the Italians, and they ended up driving them out of Africa because that was the first time they could fight a land war against the Germans and the Allies. After winning North Africa, they soon went on to advance in Italy. They first invaded the island of Sicily to beat the Italians. Then they went on to invade Rome, which is known as the Battle of Monte Cassino. After winning, the Italians had really no reason to be in the war anymore, so they forfeited and they also surrendered. After the Italians surrendered, it was just the Nazis and the Japanese that were the main parts of the Axis powers, and the Allies had one less enemy to worry about. This soon would change when they would invade on D-Day. After that, the Allies attempted to enter France, which was known as a day called D-Day, on June 6, 1944. They first sent a wave of paratroopers to stop the Germans in Normandy. They then followed by sending troops along 5 beaches in Normandy. This was the way to establish a front in After the successful attacks during D-Day, the Allies soon advanced further into France with the attacks on Paris and Saint-Lô. After that, they ended up maintaining their ground along the Rhine River and trying to find a way into Germany. After planning to find a way into Germany, they decided to undertake Operation Market Garden, which dropped the 101st Airborne into Holland. They would then try and go through Belgium and advance into Germany through the north part of Germany, since the Germans were thought to be all young kids and old men during those parts. It ended up being a failed mission and got some of the 101st Airborne stuck in the Ardennes forests, which resulted in the Battle of the Bulge, which was during the winter of 1944 before 1945. The Americans ended up winning the Battle of the Bulge after a long fight there of just straight stalemate. The Americans soon found their way into Germany and they ended up attacking Germany very quickly, and they ended up attacking Berlin as well and taking Berlin, which knocked the Germans out of the war. And the Soviets also advanced through the Eastern Front and invaded Poland and into Germany as well, as the Battle of Berlin, which involved the Soviet Union and the Americans, ended up knocking Hitler and the Germans out of the war. Hitler soon killed himself. During this time, Hitler did not see the Germans losing the wars at all. So when he found out he was losing the war, he did not see that coming. Heading back to the Pacific Theater of War, the Americans advanced along the Pacific. They attacked places such as Peleliu, like I mentioned earlier, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Saipan, and the Mariana Islands. The Americans dropped 2 nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that forced the Japanese to surrender to the Americans, and that concluded World War II. The war lasted a very long time, and some wonder why, but I believe it's because they were a key conflict and issue during World War II was that Nazi Germany discriminated against Jews, homosexuals, and people with disabilities, along with many other groups of people. It was during this time where 6 million Jews were killed in concentration camps such as Auschwitz and Buchenwald. People in these concentration camps were murdered and massacred with unjust reasons. They were sometimes experimented on by Dr. Mengele, and they were also put into gas chambers, which ended up Some continuities during World War II was the treatment of African Americans at this time. In the Americas, they segregated units. Another continuity during World War II is that before World War II, they had the League of Nations, which was not as powerful, but after a result of World War II, there was the United Nations, and both organizations attempted for There were many things that changed during World War II. Some of the changes were that there's no longer fascism involved in these countries. They had new political parties. Europe was now divided between the Soviets and the Americans, and there are now 2 superpowers as a result of the end of World War II, known as the United States and the Soviet Union, thus resulting in the Cold War as well. Another change during World War II is that the economy of the United States was booming. They were in the Great Depression before World War II, and entering the war caused the economy to grow. There are also many new advanced technologies that appeared during World War II, such as the nuclear weapon, but one of the most important, but not really talked about inventions, was the invention of radar by the British. This allowed the Britons an advantage during World War II, was that the Axis were in ruins. Europe was also in ruins along with Japan. Some other effects of World War II include many independence movements along South and Southeast Asia and in Africa, such as India, Sri Lanka, and South. The independence movements were able to concur because Europe was no longer focused on these countries during the war. In fact, the Japanese even eliminated the white people are unstoppable mindset among these colonizers. Other parts of the world that were not really involved in World War II, such as Latin America, they also were impacted by the war as they were allowed to grow and they grew more politically and economically as well. Latin America was also involved during and after World War II, as many people who were facing war crimes fled to countries like Brazil and Argentina to escape the war crimes they would have to face. Some culture during World War II is that there are many new advances in literature and arts, as there are many new stories to tell from the war and about the Holocaust, as they did not want the Holocaust to happen again or as bad of a war to happen. Many people after and during World War II also fled their countries and moved elsewhere, like to the United States, as many Jews sought refuge into the United States, along with many other Asian countries and European colonies coming to America, which ended up combining certain cultures with certain parts of the world. There are even some parts of the world where the Jewish people were allowed to go as their own homeland. And this was during the war, while our boys fought overseas, the women also played an active involvement during World War II. They were the ones that worked in the factory and looked after America at home, and also were the nurses during World War II. And after World War II, they wanted to maintain these positions, which set up the structure for many women's rights movements post-World War. However, during World War II, people of Japanese nature in the Americas were interned and discriminated against after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Americans also discriminated against African Americans, and they're still segregated, which set up the way for many civil rights movements later on in the 1960s. Thank you for watching Crash Course AP World History by Sean Kenny, and I hope you all pass the AP World exam this year, and I look forward to seeing your scores on July 8th. World War II can be considered a turning point in world history, as it was pretty much the date that advanced the world into the modern technology age, after all the advanced technology that came out of World War II.